The rule of law. Do you really have equal protection under the law anymore? Now, troubling developments around the country and in the Pacific Northwest are raising these important questions, and I actually think that we should discuss this today. Now, regular viewers of my channel know that I don't typically discuss national issues, and I try to focus on the local issues in Washington State and the Pacific Northwest because it's closer to home and more impactful on our daily lives. However, I'm going to integrate some of the national issues that are into some of these local issues that I believe really matter to you and I. And I also want to discuss what you and I should do about it. So, what is the rule of law? I mean, typically this is defined as a key principle for fair and peaceful societies where everyone is equal and accountable before clear and known laws. In America, this was a fundamental belief held by our founding fathers, and this concept was integrated into the U.S. Constitution and, of course, our Bill of Rights. For brevity's sake, I'm being a bit simplistic here, but most people have an instinctive sense of when you're living in a society supported by a rule of law. If you are in a police state like North Korea, a theocracy like Afghanistan, or anarchy like Somalia, there's really no rule of law. You have no free speech, for example. There are rules for sure, like you don't do anything to criticize the government or the dominant ideology, and you stay quiet and you obey. But that is different than a society governed by a rule of law. Now, I believe, unfortunately, that we are witnessing a total collapse in the rule of law in America today, and this is happening along several kind of simultaneous fronts. I mean, the first and most obvious, and here's where I'm integrating a national story into kind of our local lives, there's clearly a two-tiered legal system across the nation when it comes to your political affiliation. And it really is shocking to witness in real time. Once you kind of get over the breathless drama and the partisan sniping, anyone with just a modicum of awareness has to realize that the legal morass and kind of power of the state directed at Donald Trump, the clear and obvious frontrunner candidate right now for president on the Republican side of the ledger, is really unlike anything that we've ever seen in American history. And this isn't just the usual one-sided, hyper-partisan bias of the media that's been kind of fossilized in the traditional media world right now for generations. No, this is actually the total weaponization of the power of the state in a coordinated fashion to destroy a politician who is certainly perceived as a threat to the establishment class in this country. Now, it really doesn't matter if you love Trump or you hate him, and he seems to certainly generate a lot of emotional drama on both extremes of that spectrum. If you're capable of being even marginally open-minded, you have to read this recent Georgia indictment, which was posted online accidentally before the grand jury even formally voted on it, that reads like some type of bizarre rant written by a Soviet-era cadre of bureaucrats who have no idea that the U.S. Constitution even exists. I mean, seriously, trying to charge all of Trump's attorneys and supporters for making political statements, asking for phone numbers, and then posting on Twitter. Now, that is an indictable crime? So integrating your personal political fundraising apparatus into the indictment and then prosecution game by the local DA is an ugly thing to witness, but it's actually increasingly common. In fact, in my own state of Washington, our state attorney general, Bob Ferguson, he's done this same thing for years now. He abuses his office to target political opponents, grandstands political lawsuits, and then uses press releases that he creates that he can quote from in his fundraising letters the very next day. That is not a healthy thing in a society with a rule of law. Now, why isn't it healthy? Well, because the rule is not applied equally. Not even close. I mean, if Trump and the list of his attorneys and supporters can be seriously indicted with some kind of pretense of legal support for this level of kind of sloppy political statements, then in an honest country with a real rule of law, we must imprison Stacey Abrams and Hillary Clinton and Al Gore and pretty much almost every elected Democrat and Democrat politician in America today, because they all basically did the same thing. And by the way, I'm not saying to imprison these people for their absurd, dumb statements over the years. If we did that, most people would be in prison today. I'm not even going to bother with the obvious insanity of ignoring the bribery and the pay-for-access crimes that are clearly documented in the dementia guy in the White House and then his crackhead criminal son. I mean, listen, drug addiction and dementia are both serious problems. And I'm sympathetic to those suffering from these problems, but that doesn't mean that we need to let people like this run our nation into the ground. And worse yet, watching our media pretend like this is nothing and then get distracted with the most recent kind of breathless headline of another attempt to get Trump. There's nothing normal about this. Something is seriously wrong here. Now, by the way, just a little personal background story, and I'm kind of reminded of this when I see people fall for the distraction techniques. And many people watching this channel probably know I grew up pretty rural, and on our little, very eccentric farm, my dad really got into raising emus for many years. And these are big birds like ostriches, a little bit smaller, but they're really large. And I often had to go give them food in their pastures when I was about 10 years old. They could be actually pretty scary animals, and the male birds would often come just running up to me as a 10-year-old kid. And I've seen them kick dogs and kind of attack before, so of course I'm nervous at that age. And one trick that my mom had taught me at the time was to quickly pick up a feather and then spin it in my hand and then distract the aggressive bird from whatever his original concerns were. Once the emu was distracted by the spinning feather, I could just drop it to the ground and the emu would peck at it and forget all about why he came storming across the pasture over to me in the first place. Now, they're not the smartest animals that we raised, and I'm always reminded of this experience when I kind of read the headlines in the traditional media today. Obviously, stories designed to distract us from the more serious stories that are out there. And most of us in the public act like these dumb emus, distracted by the spinning feather and not really paying attention to the original concerns that we had. So now back to the topic. No, I'm not saying that no sane person can pretend that this is a legitimate rule of law when the law is exclusively applied to only one political candidate and everyone else gets a pass. That's clearly not right. But let's talk about the collapse in the rule of law closer to home and get away from the national embarrassing spectacle that our political and media class basically they've become for the world to mock and, of course, dictatorships to take notes. If you like what you see here, by the way, don't forget to hit like, share, and subscribe in this channel. Go down below. YouTube has obviously been aggressively shadow banning our channel for years now, but we're still able to exist today because of people just like you. If you want to learn more, go to the video description below. If you want to support me, subscribe to my email newsletter, or just share this video with your best lefty friends. So back to a local collapse in the rule of law, and this shouldn't make anyone happy to see what is happening all around us today. One of the biggest and most obvious problems with the general, and I kind of believe completely accurate assessment that the rule of law is collapsing all around us is the fact that this kind of anti-police, pro-violent criminal policy exclusively owned, celebrated, and promoted by the left right now in our nation, and of course even in our state, that it's no longer just a fringe concept confined to struggle sessions at Evergreen State College and then maybe some Soros-funded symposium somewhere. It is now formal public policy by many of the prosecutors in our state and elsewhere to give a free pass to violent criminals. No matter how many times they're caught and arrested, these criminals are right back out on the streets quickly as they can steal, assault, and harm more victims in our community. And this really is not a good thing outside of the weird kind of lefty world looking to destroy our nation. Crime has actually been higher in the past, and particularly if you look at the historic crime statistics, but we are on a rapid escalation that may eclipse those records set in past generations. Worse than this, our current political establishment is really trying to recategorize crimes or conceal true crime stats. It just isn't college campuses where this happens. Even in our bigger cities and towns, law enforcement is being pressured to downgrade crimes and then to make it look like things are just not as bad as they obviously are. Now, presumably, these political choices to implement policies that obviously increase the crime committed against regular people, while at the same time trying to pretend that it isn't happening or actively work to conceal the truth, that this is exclusively being pushed by the lefty side of the political world. At least in our state and cities today, at the same time, these same prosecutors seem focused on destroying anybody who dares to defend themselves from a criminal or possibly sin against the administrative state by maybe building a porch that's too big or stepping on a pocket gopher hole in Thurston County, raising a cow within 800 yards of a day dry creek bed maybe, or even owning a horse in Whatcom County. Now, an example of the collapse of the rule of law is to see cases like this recent Andy Ngo case out of Portland, where Antifa clearly, openly, and happily physically assaulted journalist Andy Ngo, and yet despite the fact that they identified the assailants, The Antifa goons clearly destroyed evidence, and Antifa and their crew, they openly intimidated the jurors, including one of the defense attorneys. And so Andy Ngo will never find justice in Portland, as evidenced by this recent ruling. Neither will anyone else, unfortunately. But don't worry, the local violent criminals will be able to do whatever they want so long as it helps Antifa destroy Portland. So what can you do? I mean, you can't possibly live in society today without having some sense that things have gone wrong. But it is easy to feel like you can do nothing about it. This is particularly true when it's so obvious that the traditional media operates like an appendage of the state, when the left is certainly in power, and big tech clearly functions as the puppet for the political elite, working very hard, in fact, to silence all dissent, like this video. A few years ago, in early 2021, you might remember that in Washington state, Governor Inslee put up fences to prevent the public from viewing the Capitol, and even to keep out many members of the Washington state legislature. It was really surreal at the time, particularly because the governor used the National Guard as props to prevent the public from being anywhere near the Capitol building. Governor Inslee then weaponized the Department of Enterprise Services, which is the bureaucracy kind of nominally dedicated to managing the Capitol campus, into harassing and threatening arrest to anyone who actually dared to come to the Capitol and commit an act of free speech. This was only being used to attack people like pro-life organizations and anyone else who was anti-establishment. No surprise, these rules weren't used against anyone on the political left because they had no reason to protest the abuse of the state. I mean, the left generally supported this abuse. At the time, I admit I was seriously frustrated with this abuse of power and the abuse of historic free speech rights. For the first time since our state capitol had been built over 100 years ago, so I really wanted to call them out and force them to arrest me for committing an act of free speech, as they had threatened on video several of my friends and other groups earlier that month. So I organized the Commit an Act of Free Speech and Get Arrested with Me event on February 6, 2021. You can see up here. At the time, I clearly communicated with the state that I was going to explicitly and intentionally violate their illegal prohibitions on having amplified speakers or using a generator and using microphones on the Capitol campus. And I also informed them that I believed that they were wrong. In fact, I provide extensive legal case history and relevant legal information explaining how I expected that they would lose in court. And I didn't want a large event at the time. In fact, I wanted it to be small and focused to force the state to follow through on their absurd and illegal threats. I fully expected to be arrested and my equipment seized, and I just wanted to make sure that we documented this for everyone to see. Now, of course, the day before the planned event, I was contacted by the DES bureaucrats, and they backed off of their threats and acknowledged that they were wrong. We actually had our event the next day. There were no arrests. Everything was peaceful and very wet. No surprise, in February, not the best time to organize an event like this, our state capitol largely went back to normal as the fences came down and the absurdity of the situation became more and more self-evident. Now, was this a huge victory? I don't really think so, but it was a victory, and it was a necessary step in restoring some level of rule of law in an obvious case of illegal and abusive overreach by the state. Was I really willing to be arrested? Now, of course I was, and actually I'm always surprised when people ask me this, as they have many times. You don't do things like this, in my opinion, unless you're completely serious and absolutely committed to going all the way. Was I prudent in the planning process for this event? Well, I'd like to think so. I had my attorneys ready and waiting. I had multiple people there with cameras to record the event in case something went wrong with just one of them. I had equipment that if seized, it wouldn't really disrupt anyone's life while we legally battled to get it back. And most of it I'd borrowed for that very day. In fact, I purposely and clearly communicated my intentions to violate the state's illegal rules, and I gave them the obvious opening and the opportunity to back down, not just for me, but for everyone else. And it worked. And it was preferable that it worked the easy way rather than having to go to court for a year and deal with the drama of an arrest. But I was completely happy and willing to take that road if the state was willing to do it to me. Now, I don't tell you the story to pump me up. Outside of my immediate family, I'm really not an important person, and I don't matter in this case other than to use this as an example of how each of us needs to find effective, localized ways to expose the complete failure of the rule of law and reasonable strategies for how to get back to the rule of law that most of us, not including the extreme lefties in government, media, big tech, and of course in our education system too, so not including those guys, the rest of us actually want to live in a society with a predictable, semi-consistent rule of law. Right now, it appears that we're sliding away from that. So what can you do to stop the slide? Well, first, work with local people in your community to document the obvious plethora of examples of the failure of a rule of law. And this is more than just whataboutism. I mean, this is mostly focused on exposing the problems that proliferate and kind of fester all around us. And here are some examples of places that I think you can start. Find out how many cases law enforcement refers for prosecution to your local prosecutor, and then start publishing the stories of the criminals who are being given basically a free pass to commit more crimes in your community. At the same time, find the examples of absurd cases of prosecution by people for stepping on a pocket gopher hole, for example, or maybe having the wrong color paint on their house, or washing their car, or whatever. People need to hear these stories to better, and the contrast between them really, to better understand the problems that are surrounding them. Now, secondly, I would suggest that you sit in on some courtroom cases and see judges make clearly biased rulings. You are unlikely to find these types of examples in maybe traffic court or routine, mundane, kind of cookie-cutter cases like that. But if you live in Thurston County, where I live, for example, you will find plenty of cases where judges bend over backwards to protect the state and are happy to destroy the rights of the citizens who live here, as long as they can keep the gravy train of state government rolling forward, regardless of any kind of corruption uncovered. Or you can basically watch judges go lenient on violent criminals, happily dropping them back into the community so that they can hurt more people. Whatever you have the time to do, it's very worthwhile. Now, I've used examples of the unequal treatment of, say, campaign finance or ethics cases in the past. I file these types of complaints all the time, and I'm building up very adequate case history, I think, of these examples. But you can do the same thing in other ways with other issues. Because listen, ultimately, we will need to basically replace the people who are in our judiciary, our bureaucracy, and in our political class who seem to think that they benefit from destroying the rule of law, your rights, and they basically are unconcerned about the damage that they're doing to us. However, this process is made far easier if you find the worst ones in your community, you document, and you clearly identify the problems, and then work to remove them. We are in the place that we find ourselves today because nobody bothered to do this over the past few decades. So let me close with just a few thoughts on very specific steps that you should start taking right now where you live to document the rule of law collapse in your community, and then hopefully provide some direction in how to get it back. You probably can't make a huge impact on the circus in D.C. or the clear corruption that we're witnessing on the national stage, but you certainly can start to fix things where you live. And here are some places I think you can start. Number one, just start tracking your local prosecutor's failure to press charges against criminals. You file a records request and then start tracking the crimes your sheriff or local police recommend be prosecuted, and then the actual cases the prosecutor rejects and ignores. The data will tell you whether you have serious people who care about the rule of law and that key position of government. Number two, start researching your local judges. See if you can find just the worst one in your community. Get specific examples of times that they fail. Find out who is the worst. You start with one. And when you can start to expose their failings and failure as an honest judge, you can start to create an opening to replace them. Now finally, just start exposing corruption in local government, and then documenting the conflict of interest, the failure to follow the law, or the abuse of the system by those in charge. And I'm sorry, but it is probably happening everywhere. But start where you live. The media used to do this. Most of the time today, though, they don't. However, in order to make this difference, we must first show up because, as always, the future belongs to those who show up.